started.
Intelligence of World War II, the realm of spies, secret codes, and a top-secret cipher machine. The movie Enigma reflects the story of the clandestine device.
The Enigma machine. It turns plain text messages into gobbledygook. The problem is the machine has 115 million ways of doing it. So, we're not talking about the Times crossword.
As some historians argue, the result of World War II could have been different if not for this electromagnetic device. Jennifer Wilcox is a curator at the National Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade, Maryland.
Breaking the codes of the German Enigma machine probably made the difference between winning the war and losing the war. There are historians who believe that the Allies' ability to break the German Enigma machine messages shortened the war by all of 2 years.
Enigma was built in 1919 in Germany for commercial purposes, but it didn't generate much interest until later, when it was adopted by the Nazis, who were looking for a cipher machine capable of servicing their expanding communication needs. Starting in 1928, constantly evolving Enigmas were used for coding and decoding all top-secret Nazi communications until the end of the war, in May 1945. The entire story of breaking the codes of the Enigma didn't fully emerge until many years later, however, with the opening of the Allied archives. One of the few existing original Enigma machines is kept in a British World War II intelligence museum in Bletchley Park, near London. Peter Westcombe is a trustee of the British Historical Foundation.
Bletchley Park was the main British cryptanalysis and cryptography centre throughout the war.
Here in the landmark mansion, the original model of Enigma is kept in a vault. Today, Peter Westcombe finds this one still in perfect working condition.
This is the keyboard on which the message you wish to encipher or decipher is keyed in. The front is what they call the Steckverbindungen or crossover. In other words, the numbers on the front relate to the letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, etc. So by pressing A, the current goes through A onto 1, which is A, and then comes out on 6, which is F. So by pressing the key, I'm not encrypting A, I'm encrypting F.
The whole Nazi communication system was based on coding and decoding messages with the Enigma. On the other side of the intelligence front, the Allies were focused on breaking the codes of the Enigma and, better yet, obtaining a current model of the machine. And here we come to a dramatic point that has especially interested movie makers on both sides of the Atlantic.
I'd say we have 4 days maximum.
The movie Enigma, like this earlier film, U-571, both concentrate on the period in World War II history when the Germans completely changed the coding system of the Enigma machine and added one more rotor. In order to be able to deal with the Nazi standard procedure of changing the codes every day and still be able to break them accordingly, the Allies desperately needed to snatch the original device.
Germans have switched their U-boats to a new code book and we're blacked out again.
Our intelligence has been shut off.
If we can't protect our merchant ships from their U-boats, we've lost the capability to invade Europe and drive the Germans out.
The story of Enigma is considered by the British to be a key part of their World War II heritage, with the codebreaker Alan Turing as the leading figure. In this context, the role of the U.S. and other Allied centers was somewhat more complex and less spectacular. But this doesn't mean that the involvement of other allies was unimportant. Jennifer Wilcox from the NSA Cryptologic Museum.
The Americans got involved in breaking the Enigma codes later on in the war when the Americans entered in 1942. We had a decisive input into really the U-boat Enigma coded messages going on in the Battle of the Atlantic. And it was due to the Americans' ability to break these different U-boat Enigma systems that allowed us to maintain those shipping lanes in the Battle of the Atlantic, keep the British supplied, and really helped to win the Battle of the Atlantic, which ultimately led to the Allied victory.
The story of breaking the Enigma codes, however, doesn't start in the middle of World War II. In fact, what the Germans didn't realize until the very last days of the war is that their top-secret cipher machine had been broken by the Polish mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Henryk Zygalski, and Jerzy Różewski several years before the war in Europe even began.
The Polish mathematicians, in fact, I suppose you could say that they formed the actual foundations of the whole of the Enigma decrypt success during the Second World War. It was three of them in particular, one in particular, a chap called Marian Rejewski, who actually teased out the cipher system of the Enigma machine itself, and therefore were able to break into the early German Enigma ciphers and until about 1939.
Let's go back to the late 1920s. The Polish government, troubled by growing tensions with neighboring Germany and by rapidly increasing numbers of intercepted coded messages, decided to create a special department of cryptology within its Ministry of Defense. The group of Polish mathematicians who later broke the Enigma codes had been selected, tested, and recruited from university mathematics departments. But initially, they didn't have much to work with. Just letters, and all in groups of 4, and an abundance of them.
It took months of analysis for the Poles to break into it. The first thing they had to do was realize, of course, that an Enigma machine was being used. And they were fortunate enough to see an Enigma as it passed through customs, but they weren't able to capture one and work on it that way. They just realized they were working with a rotor system. So the next set that they had to work on was actually determining the wiring of those internal rotors.
Analyzing intercepted training messages, they noticed that in one of them, the letter Y played a prominent role. Were these interrogatory sentences? In German, many questions begin with pronouns like wer, wo, wann, wohin. The Polish codebreakers, fluent in German, noticed that after an assumed question on the same radio frequency came a reply of only 4 groups. Could it be an answer to some typical question? A historical date, maybe? Then how about a question like, when was Beethoven born? No, this was no good, because it had to be 6 words. So maybe, when was Frederick the Great born? It clicked, and suddenly everything became simple. Later, the cryptologists also noticed another regularity.
Now, one of the things about the Enigma is that it never encrypts by reproducing its own letter. In other words, A will never ever encrypt as A. It will always encrypt as the other 25 letters of the alphabet, but never as A.
By 1933, the Enigma codes were fully broken, and Polish intelligence was able to read almost all Enigma intercepts. Based on some additional data provided by the French, engineers in Warsaw were able to recreate a working copy of the particular Enigma used by the German army. Again, Peter Westcombe of Bletchley in England.
Now, this was a psychological barrier because there was a lot of concern in this country up to the war that, in fact, the modern Enigma could not be broken. And it was only when, in fact, in 1939 in the July, when the officer commanding Bletchley Park, Commander Denniston, Royal Navy, and another one of the great code breakers of the First World War, a chap called Dilly Knox, were invited out to Warsaw with their French counterparts, and the Poles said to them, look what we've done. We've actually broken Enigma.
But at that time, the Nazis had switched to a different and upgraded coding system, making the work of the Poles obsolete. 2 months after the Enigma machine was passed to the British and the French intelligence, World War II broke out, and the battle for breaking the constantly elusive Enigma codes erupted with a new force on all Allied intelligence fronts.
Say, this lifeguard stuff is new to me, but it has its